All right, what is going on there, fellas? Hopefully, I have my mic on here. Um, Today, we are going to go back to back, same type of video. We're doing another client highlight slash program breakdown. Today, we're going to be looking at Jared. I've been coaching Jared, I want to say for like 2 years at this point. Though I'm just kind of picking that number out of nowhere. Jared trains at the same gym back in Washington that I used to train at, which is how I met him. He approached me and said, "Hey, man, would you help me out with my programming?" I said, "Absolutely." And we have had a ton of success since. Jared's 20 years old. He is here, as you can see here, his best lifts are a 540 squat, a 390 bench press, and a 617 deadlift. And all of these numbers have been steadily improving block to block. Honestly, I think every single block we've made substantial progress in those 2 years. And he's come a long way. And so today, I figured I would highlight some of his best lifts here on his Instagram. We're going to take a look at his technique, maybe talk about some things he does well and some things he could do better. And then we're going to tab over to his new training block and kind of discuss what it is that we are doing in our effort to continue making Jared stronger and to kind of fill up the huge potential he has as a strength athlete. I also coached his pop for a little bit, and he had like a 415 incline bench. So Diesel kind of runs in the family, and Jared has the potential. He's a bigger guy, has a reasonably sized frame, is reasonably tall. And as he continues to fill out those leverages and gain weight and gain muscle, I think Jared has the potential to be very, very strong. So first, we're going to look at some of his lifts. I'll give you what I think, highlight what techniques he's kind of leaned into as he's become a more advanced lifter. And then we're going to talk about his program. His program is going to be a little bit different, right? Because I've been working with Kel, who we talked about the other day, for even longer than I have Jared. And we, as he's gotten extremely advanced, closing in rapidly on a 500 dots, we've had to kind of make some aspects of his programming more specialized. Whereas Jared has had such continued block to block success that we haven't had to, let's say, really make his program all that unique yet. But we're going to give it a breakdown anyway of what like maybe a more generic program will look like, because usually I'll start someone out on more of a general synopsis of my methodology. Obviously, I'll look at their lifts. If they have glaring weaknesses, it'll inform my exercise selection. But the framework and the progressions are pretty standardized. And as I work with them for longer and as I see things work and not work, things tend to deviate more and more. So the athletes I've worked with the longest tend to have the most unique programming. But Jared, because he's gotten stronger every single block, hasn't really had to diverge that much. So that'll be interesting. Also, him and Kel, the guy from yesterday's video, are currently racing to the 405 bench. So you guys can tune in and check that out. Here was his 10-pound bench press PR from this training cycle. Getting real close to that 405. I think one of the things that we need to develop. So if you watch his bench press here, and I did remember to mute the audio this time. So hopefully this one will not be as scuffed as yesterday's video. But celebration aside, when this resets eventually, Jared, trim your videos, bro. You can see, I would say, less advanced technique than Kel, right? So one thing we could look at is maybe I would like him to try to rotate his feet to run more parallel with the bench. This isn't something that I would force. If he said, "Hey, Sam, I tried it and it feels like shit," that would definitely fall into the category of, okay, I felt it was worth a try, but I don't think it's so beneficial that we need to force it. But I usually tell people that if they're doing a heels up bench with the feet tucked back like this, try to rotate, kind of internally rotate that femur. Some people like to squeeze the bench with their adductor. It lets you direct the direction of your leg drive more back towards your spotter to maybe assist you in driving that bar backwards and create an arch via driving backwards. Whereas when you kind of rely on driving your knees outward, like kind of twisting your feet into the ground outward to create stability, right? Because when we get into our position, usually we want to create some extra tightness. So first things first, we're getting tight through the quads. We're driving those heels towards the floor. We're tight through the quads, and we're almost hovering the ass on the bench. In yesterday's video, you could see Kel do this very well. Here we can see Jared do this, I would say, medium well. So we first and foremost, we have that tensioning through the quads, maybe turning the feet to direct that leg drive in the direction we want, because when the toes are out, that leg drive tends to go straight up. And the direction of leg drive should be backwards, not upwards. Upward isn't going to help you lift the bar. And if anything, it's just kind of pushing you towards your lift being illegal and your ass coming off the bench. And sometimes people will find that they want a little bit more stability than just their quads tensed. So one of the ways they can create that stability is either cramming their knees out or squeezing them in a little bit. And I used to shove my knees out, and it led to that same general propensity of my hips to come upward rather than backwards. And it wasn't until I started squeezing in a little bit more that I was able to tension through the lower body without big leg drive making an illegal bench where my ass came up. So I'd say that maybe we could be a little more tense through the legs, rotate the feet, maybe squeeze the adductors inward. It doesn't have to be super exaggerated. Again, there's flexibility within these things. These are things that he can try for a couple of sessions, and if he doesn't start to gain some steam on them, he's an advanced enough lifter that I would definitely just take it at face value. This isn't the move for Jared. Arch is okay. Not huge, not bad. I would say that that's not something that I think he needs to force better necessarily. I think that he could be up on his traps a little bit more if he was driving a little harder through the quads, sliding himself towards his spotter, and then using the weight to stop himself from sliding, driving himself up onto his traps, and that's how he could create just a slightly more declined bench press. I think Jared's bench is a very good example of there's nothing he's missing. There is no singular cue or concept that I think is absent from his bench, but they all could be executed a little bit better. His back tightness is pretty good here, especially when you're someone who benches with a narrower grip width, as Jared does. There's a limit to the amount of retraction you could achieve. I think he could be definitely, this one exposes we could be driving up into that arch a little better. We could probably get the feet backwards in this position a little bit more to get that press a little bit more declined. And then I think the overall back tightness, both scaps back and down, could potentially be greater in magnitude. As far as the press itself, gets a little uneven, but there's no real errors there. Let's see. Couple other things we're going to touch on in the bench press. As you can see here, Jared's elbow comes just a little bit outside of his wrist. We like to usually see someone maintain stacked joints all the way through their sticking point. I think in this case, it's just that Jared has a strong chest and he kind of naturally flares the elbows out to utilize it. In this case, I think it's the fact that his grip is probably a finger width too narrow. So gradually we've been moving his grip out with time. Rather than making huge jumps, we've just kind of been moving it one finger width at a time. I think that early in someone's training career, it's not the worst thing in the world for them to have too narrow of a grip for what might be optimal for them. Because that greater range of motion is going to lend itself potentially to gaining more muscle mass, and it's like we can always kind of play that card down the road as we are with Jared of gradually moving it outward. And moving out that grip width is something that we can do to kind of smooth this out, right? So in this press, you can see he gets really good power off of his chest. And kind of like Kel, once he gets towards that top region and he's in the position to do so, locking the elbows isn't too much of a struggle. Jared, like Kel, kind of struggles in this mid-transition range where he's driving that bar back to a position where he could lock it out. I do think that Jared does not have that huge surplus of tricep strength that Kel has. So dips will probably be a vital part of us closing in on that 405 bench. But again, like Kel, that front delt strength to drive the bar back is something that we need to continue developing for Jared, because the power off the chest is good. We want to keep that chest a strength, but we also probably need a little bit more strength around the shoulder girdle. The next thing we're going to take a look and highlight is going to be, let's see, where is your squatting footage? All right, so here we go. Here's his best meat squat with 540. As you can see, Jared is certainly a mid-bar squatter. not true high bar. He used to, I think we got him up to about 500 high bar before we started transitioning that bar lower. Again, because when he's a younger, newer athlete, maybe we can use these techniques that aren't the best way to lift the most weight possible right now, but they could be beneficial from a developmental perspective. So we transitioned him from a true high bar all the way up to 500 to more of a mid bar. Jared is built a lot like I am. He's got a long torso, he's got short arms, and he's got shorter legs. So he's able to do this narrow stance squat with a mid bar and stay stock upright. And I don't think he would be substantially stronger if he crammed that bar lower and hinged more. I think that this is, with his leverages and strengths, very locked in for him, which is a good place to be, because as a big bencher, if you're someone who also benefits from a mid bar position, that can spare you some of that wrist, elbow, and shoulder fatigue coming from heavy straight bar back squats, which can kind of stunt the progression of your bench press. So Jared is the kind of guy who's going to have a really competitive subtotal. Being that longer torso, shorter limbed guy, he's going to be already a great bencher. It's a motion that came easy to him, and he has favorable leverages. So like neurally, as well as like build wise, it's something that he's good at. He has a lot of room to even continue improving his technique. He has a lot of room to put on muscle. I could foresee Jared putting up a monster bench as he continues to develop, because there's just so much potential to get better, and it's already very good. And with this mid-bar squat, we get to peak all the way through a training cycle without his upper body falling apart and getting in the way of his bench pressing. The next thing we're going to look at, I'm sure you guys have seen it after watching this a couple times. Jared has this funky start mechanic, which is, it's a very exaggerated thing that, like, it's been a feedback loop. He's had this kind of motor pattern forever of rocking the hips back and then beginning the squat. Functionally, this makes sense. It's just because Jared, being a kind of quad dominant lifter, longer torso guy, has a position to almost underutilize his posterior chain and squat. Just like for Kel, the breakdown might be a squat turning into a good morning. Jared has an issue of almost trying to stay too upright to where he's not effectively using his posterior chain. So what he does is, at the beginning, when he gets his air, he rocks his hips back and kind of preloads his posterior chain. So there's already some load being carried through there, and then he squats straight downward from that slightly back position. Is this the most efficient way to do it? Who knows? It's worked for him so far, and I don't feel super inclined to change it. He has not gotten a light for it in the meet, though he definitely could for that little bit of up and down motion. Eventually, we would want to make this more fluid to where we have no doubt about comp legality, but it's worked well for him. Kind of going bottom up, Jared utilizes a relatively narrow stance with his toes turned out. So he's going to be having his knees travel forward a good bit, as most guys with very strong quads do. As you can see, we're way out over his toe. He leaves the knees out over the toe, so he doesn't have that technical fault. He kind of, as he gets to his sticking point, he scoops his hips right back under that bar, and the knees almost, as he sticks, shift back forward. So he does this very well. He utilizes his quads from this narrow stance well. He uses the squat chute to do so. The other thing we notice is that his toes are maybe unusually far out, and this is going to be utilizing his glute and adductor strength, which is also quite good. The way I like to teach it is there's kind of 3 ways we can get depth and 3 ways we can kind of move weight on our squat. The first one is via quad strength, like the knees traveling forward, staying forward, like this pretty upright squat, which Jared has in abundance. We're going to touch on what we do in his training to keep Jared's quads so strong, but that's something he has a good amount of. The next way we can get kind of depth and strength is kind of driving the knees out. So abduction at the hips. So strengthen the glutes, strengthen the adductors is what's going to allow us to squat down via driving the knees out. And then the third one is hinging. And Jared uses a technique where he leans really heavily into the knee travel aspect, and he leans really heavily into the driving the knees outward aspect, because those are 2 of his strengths, to where he doesn't have to use as much of a hinge, because that's a little bit more of his weakness, which we're about to get to taking a look at his deadlift, right? As you could expect from someone who has that long torso, short limb build, Jared is a good squatter who's continuing to get better. We made it all the way to 500 high bar. We transitioned down into a mid bar position. And he's going to continue to get better and better at the squat. It's something that has come reasonably quickly to him. Our momentum is very good, all good. As we can see, also that same build tends to be pretty good for bench press. He's a very good bench presser, continues getting better, and like I talked about, I see a huge amount of potential for Jared to. I think Jared will probably bench 500 eventually, just because there's so much room to get better. I think in a lot of ways, the way Jared lifts is very, very similar to how I lifted when I was younger, actually. I squatted with a mid-bar position because I wanted to be quite upright, as that was my strengths. I had these shorter limbs and a longer torso, so I could. And I did the same thing Jared did, where, yeah, I used my quads a lot by pushing my knees a reasonable bit forward, and I also turned my toes out from this narrow stance so I could open my hips a lot and get depth without needing to hinge forward very much. So I used a very similar approach to Jared on my squat. I think the only big difference was that I wore flats for mine and I was more immobile, so I had to take a wider grip. Jared's bench looks extremely similar to how I benched when I was in that weight range, maybe slightly more technical. I was doing some ego lifting at that point and doing some shitty reps. But the general approach he's taking of, okay, heels up, narrower grip, all around, his bench looks very similar like mine used to, and I feel that in that case, he can kind of follow what I've done in terms of taking where he's at now to where I'm at now, filling out the frame, prioritizing muscle gain, and then just working on those tightness mechanics for the bench press will take him, presumably, the huge distance that it took me as well. So I definitely think that'll be some easy gains that Jared can cash in on. But then, just like me, when you have this build, you got all these strengths, the deadlift does not quite come so easy. So one of our bigger struggles, right, we've made this extremely predictable and linear growth on the squat, extremely predictable and linear growth on the bench. The deadlift has been really hit or miss. He's managed to work his way up to where he has a very respectable bench at 617, but it's not the lift that comes easily to him. And a lot of that is just leverages, right? When you have a longer torso, you have a longer lever that's trying to bend, so it's more difficult for you to keep your back flat than it is for other people with a shorter torso. And because your arms are short, you're having to get down further to the bar, and it feels like you have, excuse me, no real estate down there. So Jared has struggled for a while to find consistent positioning in his start position. He's got good strength. As you can see, he's able to take the weight from start to lockout, but the ability to kind of have an even resistance curve of it's the same difficulty off the floor as it is at lockout is something that he struggled with, and that's the difficulty of finding a good start position. So we're going to break it down here. He elects to turn his toes out. This is just a personal preference for most people. Usually you're going to be able to utilize your glutes maybe a little bit more efficiently with the toes turned out like he does. But one of the downsides is your knees go outward, so you have to take your grip slightly wider than you would if you were someone with more of a straight toe angle. Given that that's how he squats, I'm sure this is just how he feels more comfortable putting force into the ground, right? He gets down into his start position, and we are going to pause it. We're going to take a look at what maybe what we could change here to try to smooth that out. He's got plenty of power off the floor. As a big squatter, especially a big high bar squatter, he's got a lot of that general muscularity that's going to let him power that weight off the floor in a more squat pattern, but he lacks the hinging strength. Just like we talked about how on his squat, we have him rely primarily on his knees traveling forward and his knees traveling out and staying quite upright rather than using hinging a lot as Kel does. I would say that is his biggest weakness. Where Kel's biggest weakness was probably through the quads and through the hips, Jared's the exact opposite, where it's kind of through his posterior chain. That is his biggest weakness. Now, the toe angle, we could try bringing that in. and see how that goes. I don't really have a strong preference for him either way. Now, the thing that I want to highlight is we talked about how Kel in his start position had a very vertical shin just like this, and how I said it was something he could mess around with, but it wasn't something I was very interested in changing because Kel's deadlift has a pretty even curve. Kel is built well to deadlift. He's got longer arms, and you'll notice that some longer arm deadlifters really like this vertical shin position. And longer arm deadlifters tend to be the best deadlifters. So if you go listen to a lot of the best deadlifters of all time, a lot of them will preach a vertical shin position. And this was something that really gave me a hard time. I would chase this vertical shin position, and I just felt exactly like Jared looks here. Just to get to the bar, I have to round over. I have to give away kind of my tension through my lats. And I didn't feel as though I had any real estate to lock in a good position. I just was trying to get down to the bar and grab it. And I could create a ton of force off the floor, even from this compromised position. But because the position was compromised, my lockout would be sticky. And it wasn't, I realized much later that, it's guys who have favorable leverages who are advocating for this very vertical shin. Someone who has to get further down to the bar might also have to push their knee forward over that bar slightly. And that was a change that I made in my deadlift that gave me a little bit more real estate to lock in a slightly more neutral mid-back. And what it did, being able to push the knees forward over the bar a little bit in my start position, let me lock in this neutral mid-back, and it made it harder off the floor and smoother at lockout, which was a trade that I certainly had the currency to make. And Jared is very much in that same boat of he's got plenty of floor speed, and he's got a plenty bad lockout where he can afford to make that change of pushing these knees out over the bar, being able to get his eyes up here, more to a forward angle, much further out in front of him, using that little bit of forward knee travel. And by doing these two things, he will lock in a more neutral mid-back angle, which will make it harder for him off the floor, but easier at lockout. And he'll just have to get used to, okay, well, it doesn't feel easy off the floor, but I know it's a net positive, so I'll stick with that. It's hard to really critique much from this angle, but I would say that he'll have a much easier time engaging his lats in that slightly more extended mid-back position that he'll get from shifting the knees forward and shifting the eyes upward. So that is a breakdown of kind of his best lifts, some things he does well, some things we're working on. And then we're going to take a look at our approach for this training cycle. So first, we're going to break down what are we doing to continue driving his good squat towards as good as it could be, which is very good. In the squat, we have a pretty standard base. Because he squats upright, he can handle a pretty solid amount of volume. Our base phase is going to be a 4x8. Historically, we've used a 3x8, but I think that a little bit more practice would do him good. So we build our base with a very, very conventional 4 sets of 8. Someone who can handle volume well. It's a pretty good range. We're going to touch on the RDLs in a minute, and then we hit our bodybuilding portion of the workout. Again, just trying to get the muscles big that we associate with a big squatter. Now, one thing that we have had a tremendous amount of success with Jared is just this simple exercise pairing of anytime when he finishes up his primary squats, he goes and works hard on the leg extension. He goes and works hard on the hack squats. And the hack squats especially, because he is that upright squatter and they mirror his positions in his comp squat more than they do for many other people, we've seen direct carryover from these. They're a very good way. I've talked about how the belt squat and the leg press can be good ways to kind of fill in more squatting volume without taxing your low back. Well, for Jared as a very upright squatter, the hack squat actually fills that role very well. One thing that is new is we're adding in just 2 working sets of loaded back extensions. Just need to fit in more posterior chain volume, right? It's a difficult battle to try to manage because when you have that long torso, your low back can usually handle less working sets, but it's also that glute hamstring low back area is the thing that you need to fight hard to be strong at. It's not going to be the thing that comes easy to you. Strong quads are going to come easy to you, and you need to be stubborn and say, God damn, I know that this comes harder to me than it does other people, but I'm going to have a strong ass posterior chain. It's just like how the long limbed lifter is going to have a strong posterior chain proportionately, and their quads are going to be difficult for them to build. That doesn't mean you can't build them. It means you need to be really stubborn, and you need to maybe select different exercises that help you build up your quads. Lots of longer limbed guys, I find doing a front squat to really force them to stay in their quads can be something that's good. It's hard for them to front squat a big percentage of their squat, but if that front squat goes up, their back squat goes up. Or like in Kel's case, if his high bar goes up, his low bar goes up, because that's always going to be his lagging area. And Jared here is on the other side of that coin. The posterior chain is going to be his lagging area for the foreseeable future due to build. So we need to, even though this is his primary squat day, we're building in these RDLs for hopefully easier to recover hinging volume. He should be doing these with like a reasonably extended back, no rounding, to really focus on developing that pure hinging pattern, getting in volume for that posterior chain. And then we're also adding in some back extensions to this block just to continue running up more hinging volume, because that's the motor pattern where he is lacking the most. We have good squatting patterns, and we are clearly, because we're driving that lift up consistently, the number of squat pattern lifts we're doing per week in the 4 during the base phase, plus some leg extensions and some hacks, puts him right in that sweet spot of, okay, this is enough to get better every training cycle, but not so much that it's not sustainable. We hang out in that sweet spot. Everything's pretty good on the squat. We do our little bit of bodybuilding so we can get some big quads. All is well in the neighborhood there. And then also on our secondary squat day, we continue building the base with some pause squats. Jared uses a reasonable amount of rebound in the bottom of his squat. So a logical variation that we've had a ton of success with is just taking away that rebound and forcing him to create force from a strict pause. Now, this is one change that we've made this training cycle. And this is actually something that he texted me about last night that I thought would be an interesting little thing to mention here. So we've talked in the past about how maybe he needs some more upper back strength, especially through his lats. If you're that long torsoed guy, you got to make sure you have a really strong upper back to help you kind of keep that bar in close. Just because there's so much more demands on keeping your back relatively neutral, it means your back needs to be that much stronger than your short torsoed counterpart if you want to deadlift at a really high level. And we've talked about that, and Jared remembered that, and he goes, hey, Sam, I feel as though, you know how you said that my upper mid-back might be weak in the deadlift? I feel like it's impacting my squat at this point. What can we do to fix that? And in this exercise slot here, for the past year and a half probably, we have been hitting SSB pause squats. And I go, that's weird, especially for high bar and mid bar squatters. I really like using the SSB squat as a synergistic pairing, because it's going to force them to build up their kind of mid-back spinal erectors more than the high bar does. The fact that Jared had a strong-ass high bar squat as a mid-bar squatter, a strong-ass SSB squat as a mid-bar squatter, is probably a good sign that his mid-back is actually quite strong. And then I realized what was going on. When you do the SSB, you kind of build up strength with this as you do difficult reps and the RPE rises. The bar rounds your mid back just a little bit, and you build up strength with a slightly rounded over like upper back area, right? And because you've built up strength there, sometimes that motor pattern will start showing up in your squat, right? So when you drive out of the hole, you get to a sticking point, you might find that your upper back starts to round over a little bit. And it's not because your upper back is weak. It's actually because your upper back is strong, right? You're using that as a compensation to keep the bar moving because you weren't confident in the ability of let's say your hinging muscles and your quads to keep the weight moving. You compromise your back position. It's just like how guys who deadlift with an extremely round back, it's not because their back is weak. Their back is so strong that they're using it as a primary mover. If anything, that's more difficult. The reason that they are rounding their back is because they've got confidence in their spinal erector strength, and they don't have confidence in their hamstring and glute strength. So, i.e., the hamstrings and glutes don't have the strength to move it with a flat back, so the back compromises and begins to move as a primary mover. And that was actually what was happening a little bit with Jared's squat, was he had gotten so strong on the SSB that when his regular squat would start to get to his sticking point, he would rely on that same motor pattern pattern and strength he's built up on the handles down SSB of letting that mid-back compromise a little bit to keep the bar moving. And this can be okay. This is a strategy that's predominantly only used by high bar and mid bar squatters, Kevin Oak being the most visible example of this, keep the bar moving via compromising the mid back, and that being a quality he trains for via his SSB good mornings and SSB squats. Jared felt like this compensatory motor pattern had gone a little bit too far. Like he was almost over relying on this. And so I said, okay, cool. We'll just swap your SSB pause squats over to straight bar pause squats and just kind of develop that more pure squat pattern we're looking for this coming training cycle or two. We've had so much success with the SSB in the past. I'm sure this is something we'll rotate back in. But because he identified that he was almost over relying on this upper back give mechanic that is reinforced by the SSB squats, we're going to get away from those for a little bit and do a higher specificity training cycle of squatting on the straight bar twice per week. Now we're going to take a look at what we are doing for his deadlift. As I mentioned here, normally we would be looking, okay, we've got like a primary squat on this day. We have our secondary deadlifting motion, and then we have squat bodybuilding work. But because his posterior chain lags behind in his squat and his deadlift, and it's a weak area, we want to challenge that in our bodybuilding work, not only on the deadlift day, but we're also choosing to challenge it a little bit on our squat day as well. One of the tools that we can use to build up a lagging muscle group is challenging it on a more frequent basis. I'm not a big believer in like the whole like train a weakness every single day, because recovery is part of the adaptive process. But rather than training the posterior chain hypertrophy work, so like the bodybuilding work once a week, we can fit in a little extra and maybe try to catch that area up. In the past, we have used sets of 8 as our base on the deadlift. I believe a 3x8 was historically what we have used as kind of his base to then build upon. This training cycle, I want to focus on his ability to lock in a mid-back position with that little bit of forward knee travel and then maintain that through the start. And if he can maintain that slightly more extended position that we are looking for, then his lockout will be smooth. So rather than using sets of 8 on regular deadlifts, we are using sets of 5 on pause deadlifts, mostly just because paused 8s ends up being such a long set that most people can't keep focus. You'll notice that 3 sets of 8 is 24 working reps. Here we have 20 working reps. So a small decrease in our volume, which I think as long as it's improving our quality of, yeah, we get to practice 1 extra set, we're not doing as many reps, we have these pauses, I think that decrease in volume will be a-okay, so long as it means higher quality reps. And then we have our bodybuilding work, which this training block, we're just doing something different to kind of keep him mentally invested. The upper back assistance for the deadlift is going to be growing amount of total volume on pull-ups, and then the additional posterior chain volume, because we did some extra hip hinging on day 1. The 2 functions of the hamstring are hinging at the hips and knee flexion. So we got a little bit of knee flexion work. So that way we train knee flexion somewhere in the program, because the short head of the hamstring only ties across the knee. It does not tie across the hip. So if you only do RDLs and deadlifts, the short head of your hamstring is not developing to the degree that it potentially could. So we make sure we include a little knee flexion work here. That's the approach we are taking to improving upon his deadlift. Now, I am crashing because I have not had breakfast yet, but we're going to go really quick over the bench. Pretty generic stuff. It's gone so well that we haven't had to change much. We are choosing to have his specificity slightly lower because Jared is young, and if he sticks with it, this can be viewed as still the beginning of his lifting career, where we're still building a base, which sounds crazy to say for a guy who just benched like 390, but because I believe his potential is that high. It's just like how some people say, oh, you should get to a 225 high bar squat before you go low bar to make sure you learn some like good pure squatting patterns and you develop your quads. And someone would say, no, you have no business moving that bar lower until you hit 315 or 405. Or I've even heard like Rondell Hunt say to one of his athletes, you got to squat 500 high bar first. It all depends on what their career trajectory kind of is going to look like. And I believe Jared's career trajectory is quite high. So I'm like, I'm okay with him having too narrow of a grip on the bench all the way into the mid 300s on the bench. I'm okay with him squatting high bar all the way up to 500 before we started even considering doing low bar, because I think that in the grand scheme of things, 5 years from now, this is all going to make a tremendous amount of sense. Now, that being said, the other thing we're doing is we are not doing a primary bench day 3 days a week. We actually still have a focused overhead day for his general development. As a close grip bencher, having strong shoulders is a little bit more important. You're probably going to see more carryover from a overhead press than a wider grip bencher would. And we're just working on building up his overhead strength, because we met, just like Kel, Jared has a little bit of a lagging shoulder girdle, and just putting on volume and strength to his overhead is a very simple means of fixing that. So we're continuing to drive that upward. We have a dedicated day. Our base is 5 working sets at RPE 7 at these ramping percentages, and then we start moving into a top AMRAP followed by some RPE based backoffs, and that's kind of the approach we're taking for the overhead. It seems to be moving him forward. We fiddled with a couple of variables. I still think that there's maybe a little bit further to go before we really have his rate of progression where it should be on the overhead press, and then once he hits a certain level of overhead strength, this will kind of move to the back burner, and this might become a Larson press day if his leg drive is better, or a long pause bench day if his leg drive still needs work. But for the time being, we're trying to build up his base that we can then use that ramping specificity card from later. We have our antagonistic work real quick, nothing special there. And then I mentioned how if someone's a close grip bencher, one of my favorite variations for them is something that's going to challenge the pecs more, because we're using a lot of shoulders and a lot of triceps in a closer grip bench, and maybe a little bit less pecs. Dumbbell bench allows him to target maybe that area that his main benching days lack, and it's been a kind of staple of his program that we've seen a ton of success with. Now, overall, if we imagine that down the line, this top exercise might be Larson press, and this overhead press moves down to a secondary priority, we can kind of glean that this is the shoulder-focused one of his pressing days. Especially obvious because the overhead press is first. So then we fill in some extra shoulder volume, kind of even out our deltoid development by hitting some rear delt volume and some lateral delt volume. We move into some tricep press downs because, again, we press today, we do some triceps today. And then also, because he's in this early development phase of his career, we're doing a little bit of curls this block, just for the same rationale as why we're doing an overhead primary day. We are still so early in his journey to be really, really strong that our focuses should be more on these general developmental qualities. On his primary benching day, we can see we're laying down a very similar base here with instead 4 working sets, because his bench press is much stronger proportionately than his overhead. We use a little bit less volume. It would probably bang him up a little bit. And we have to do it twice a week. So I don't think 5 working sets here would be all that sustainable or beneficial. They're ramping percentages from day to day and then week to week. And then we move into, again, percentage-based singles. Some of the guys I have work off of top AMRAPs. Some of the guys I have work off of pure straight sets all the way up until the end. And some guys I have work off of these percentages. Some guys RPE, some percentages, largely kind of based on my perception of the psychology of the athlete. Also, for anyone who made this deep, Jared, presumably you made it this deep, you need to start logging your goddamn training so I have something to look at. You got to keep me in the loop here, man. Aside from that, we then move into RPE-based backdowns. Jared has shown many times now that he's very responsible with his use of backdowns. He doesn't overshoot, he doesn't undershoot. It's just a good way to get in difficult sets at the rep ranges we're looking for. I think because I trust Jared's RPE and weight selection, it's the same reason we use these RPE capped ramping sets, where I set a minimum and I expect him to ramp from there. I think he finds a very good sweet spot most of the time, especially on his squat, on those ramping sets, of hitting hard enough sets to be better this time of the training cycle than he was last time, but also not just chronically overshooting for his ego. Then we have incline bench press, exact same rationale as Kel. Yes, it is an extended range of motion press, but Jared's bench is already a pretty big range of motion, so that's not the real reason. It's just because we're shifting some emphasis to those front delts that need to come up. And because we are far removed from his deadlifting session in this week, over here, we get to really blast his upper back a bit on this first bench day. So we usually like to see a little bit of pulling with the pushing. Well, today, because of this proximity to the deadlift day, we don't have to worry about that lat fatigue impacting his deadlift. And like I said, if you're a guy with a longer torso, this shit's really important to build up a crazy strong upper and mid back, so that way you can support this longer lever that you have to deal with. So for some people, just doing a little bit of pulling volume here, a little bit on the overhead day, and a little bit on the deadlift day would be enough for them to have a well-developed upper back. But Jared's upper back needs to be so developed due to his leverages that we need to take a secondary session to really hammer it. And that's where we hit this chest-supported row and lat pull-down focus session with 6 working sets, and then ending with some arm work, pretty standard. And then last thing we're going to look at is his secondary bench day. You'll notice no antagonistic work here, so there's no pulling to match this pressing. Because we are doing some pulling on the deadlift day, as well as the fact that we're deadlifting the following training session. So we don't want that fatigue impacting his ability to keep the weights in close. If someone doesn't have issues with that and they don't have this long torso, they might be able to get away with doing some decent working sets of pull downs the day before their deadlifts without it impacting their ability to pull. Whereas someone like Jared, we want to make sure that the mid back is coming in fresh so that we can utilize it well. So we basically just took the pulling volume we would be doing here on the secondary bench day and moved it to the deadlift day to avoid it pre-fatiguing us for the deadlifts. We have some dips. This is just our general tricep strength builder, because if you overhead press, you're actually going to be slightly weaker than an incline press, which is weaker than a flat press, which is weaker than a decline press, which stands to reason that just based on the physiology of our muscles, a downward press is going to be the strongest. And if you tally up the added load plus your body weight, if someone who trains bench press, overhead press, and dips are going to have the greatest absolute load for the most reps. And that's a lot of where the tricep benefits of dips come from, is the fact that we're being forced to extend the elbows with the most weight that we're going to be extending the elbows with of any pressing plane through a big range of motion. Because let's just say, would be a good example. If you take someone who trains dips pretty seriously, their total weight, so body weight plus added load, set of 10 is going to be actually more than they could bench for a set of 10 generally. And that's where a lot of those tricep benefits are coming from. Now, of our 3 days, this is the pressing day that we're biasing towards the triceps a little bit. So we do that standard exercise pairing you guys have heard me talk about that I like, which is train the muscle in a shortened position for 3 sets, then train the muscle in a lengthened position for 3 sets with the press downs and then the overhead extensions. And again, we're just sneaking in some arms just because. That would be my breakdown. Thank you guys for watching.